She never imagined that the men who once humiliated her in handcuffs would one day stand before her awaiting judgment. Natalia Carter had spent her life fighting for justice, but she never expected to become the face of it. What started as a peaceful afternoon in the park turned into a moment of public humiliation, one that would set off a chain of events far beyond her control. Now, the very officers who arrested her would face her again, but this time, she held the gavel. When two officers arrested her, they had no idea they'd face her again, this time in court as the judge deciding their fate. It was a sunny afternoon in Boulder, Colorado. The park was alive with the sound of children playing, joggers pacing along the trail, and families picnicking under the shade of tall oak trees. Amid this bustling yet peaceful scene, a black woman sat on a bench near the pond, a thick hardcover book resting on her lap. Her name was Natalia, a well-respected attorney taking a rare moment to escape her demanding schedule. She was immersed in her reading when the sharp screech of tires broke her concentration. A police cruiser pulled up to the curb, catching the attention of a few onlookers. Two officers stepped out, their expressions stern, radiating authority. Their eyes immediately locked onto Natalia, the only person sitting alone in the vicinity. "Ma'am, may we speak with you for a moment?" one officer called out, his voice carrying an air of suspicion rather than concern. Natalia glanced up for her book, her calm demeanor unwavering. "Of course," she replied, closing the book carefully. The second officer stepped closer, his tone clipped. "We got a call about some suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Natalia raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled. "Suspicious activity? I'm just sitting here, reading." She held up the book as if to prove her point, but their scrutiny didn't waver. "Can we see some ID?" the first officer demanded. Her pulse quickened, but she remained composed. "I don't understand. What's the reason for this?" "It's routine," the second officer said, though his tone implied otherwise. The small crowd that had gathered began to murmur. Some looked curious, while others exchanged uncomfortable glances, sensing the imbalance in the interaction. Natalia sighed and reached into her bag, pulling out her wallet. As she handed over her driver's license, one officer took it, scanning the information with unnecessary intensity. "Natalia Carter," he read aloud, almost mockingly. "What's your business here, Miss Carter?" Natalia inhaled deeply, trying to keep her patience intact. "I live in this city. I came here to enjoy the park. Is that a problem?" The officer's lips tightened. "We'll see." He handed her ID back, but instead of walking away, they continued to linger, asking questions that felt less like routine and more like an interrogation. "Do you always carry a book like that around?" one officer sneered. "Are you alone here, or waiting for someone?" the other added, his hand resting on his belt in an unmistakably deliberate gesture. Natalia had handled countless tense situations in courtrooms, but this was different. The power dynamic was stark, and their tone carried an edge she recognized all too well. Still, she chose her words carefully. "I'm not answering any more questions unless you tell me what I'm being accused of," she said firmly. Her refusal seemed to trigger something in them. The first officer stepped forward. "Don't get smart with us," he snapped. "We're just doing our job. And I know the law," Natalia replied, her voice steady. "I'm not breaking it by sitting in a public park." But reason was not on their agenda. The first officer reached for her arm. "You're resisting," he said, though Natalia hadn't moved. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed, startled. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. A man pulled out his phone to record the scene. "Stop resisting," the officer repeated, louder this time, as if performing for the growing audience. Natalia's heart raced as she felt the cold metal of handcuffs snap around her wrists. She tried to stay calm, even as humiliation and frustration burned in her chest. The officers led her toward their cruiser, ignoring the questions from onlookers. Natalia turned her head toward the crowd, locking eyes with a young woman holding up her phone. For a moment, there was an unspoken exchange, a silent plea to document the injustice unfolding. But as the car door slammed shut, Natalia knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Inside the cramped back seat of the police cruiser, Natalia's mind raced. She had spent years defending clients, standing up for justice, and navigating the legal system. But now, she was on the other side of it. The absurdity of the situation struck her, but there was no humor in it, only anger. The ride to the station was suffocatingly silent, save for the crackle of the police radio. Natalia stared out the window, her reflection merging with the passing scenery. Her wrists ached from the cuffs digging into her skin. At the station, things only got worse. The booking process was invasive, humiliating, and designed to strip her of her dignity. She was fingerprinted, photographed, and led to a small holding cell with fluorescent lights that buzzed relentlessly. "Enjoy your stay," one of the officers said smugly as he shut the cell door. Natalia sat on the cold bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She replayed the events at the park over and over in her mind. How had such a peaceful moment spiraled into this? The answer was as clear as it was bitter: prejudice. Hours passed before anyone acknowledged her again. A young officer approached the cell, holding a clipboard. "Miss Carter, you've been charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer," he said flatly. "On what grounds?" Natalia asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "You can discuss that in court," he replied before turning away. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to think strategically. The charges were flimsy, and she knew it. But she also knew the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. Cases like hers rarely were. Eventually, Natalia was released on bail. As she walked out of the station, the cool night air hit her like a wave, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. She spotted her colleague and friend, Michelle, waiting by the curb. "Natalia." Michelle rushed over, her face a mixture of relief and concern. "Are you okay?" Natalia nodded, though her body betrayed her with a slight tremor. "I'm fine," she said, though the word felt hollow. As they drove away, Michelle kept glancing at her, waiting for her to speak. Finally, Natalia broke the silence. "I'm not letting this slide, Michelle. Not this time." Michelle's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I'm tired of this happening," Natalia replied. "I have the tools, the knowledge, and the resources to fight back, and I will." That night, Natalia sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by legal pads and open books. She worked tirelessly, outlining a civil rights lawsuit against the officers and the department. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from a simmering determination. And the fight for justice had only just begun.